We were talking about museums and libraries. And just to remind you where we were, slideshow, view show. Okay, this is the Whitney Museum again. This is the one in New York that's like a castle or a fortress, and the idea of the art of the museum was to protect the art from the city. You walked across the bridge, I know you remember this. And then we started to talk about a new idea that a lot of the contemporary architects prefer, and that's to bring the city into the building. And you know, so it's not that the Whitney is a bad idea or a bad, or right or wrong, but there's a conflict or there's a discussion among architects and among patrons about whether they want these institutions to be, you know, open to the public in any situation and invite people in regardless of what their interest in the art is or what the interest in the library is, or do they want to protect the collection of art or the books from casual use in order to enable those people that are most interested in it to have the best opportunities to appreciate it. Anyway, the tendency today is to try to get people to come into the museums. And that's what if you remember, we talked about the single surface problem, which is what this was. So the street, wow, that's right. Can you see that red dot? It's blue. It's got a little shiny, it's got a little smiley face on it. You see it? Red one, see? Sorry. No, it doesn't. You see you see the street comes in, turns up, and then that little thing that's going that way, oh yeah, I can use this thing. Street, sidewalk, stores. Remember all that? Then we looked, and so that was the single surface idea, and this is a device architects are using, we're using to bring the city or the public, at least in your imagination, into the building. And so we've been developing the single surface idea. Well, this building that we're about to conclude on libraries is the Seattle Library, and it's showing the evolution of that idea to a new stage. And so I want to discuss it. Actually, if you look kind of attention, shoot. You see that line right there? That's the street. That's the Florida building. These are all offices. So when you walk in, you walk off the ground, just like we've been talking about. So you get on this kind of surface, and we're gonna follow it. It has a kind of single surface about it, but the first thing it does is remove you from the city, but not in the same way that the bridge is trying to remove you in the Whitney. It's trying to remove you sort of, well, we'll see. Now, if you look here, this is all public space. So you come in, these are the stacks of the books, and you come in and you circulate through here, but all this down here at the bottom is public space. It's used by lots and lots of people, as you can see, and so it's a really wide open, it's kind of a neat library, although you can't really see any books and you can't see anybody studying. And so this library really is about this other idea. But instead of bringing the city in, like these do, it does something slightly different. It leaves the city, but not on a staircase. This surface kind of takes off. It looks kind of like that, don't you think? I don't know. It's an inverted pyramid, as on the point of this slide. These slides are hard to get, you know. And then, but what's going to happen here is instead of literally having a surface fold through the building, you're going to start to see the use of decorative materials to produce a completely new kind of coherence and to change the nature of the library. Not only the nature of the library is something that's in Seattle, but the nature of the library is something where you go to in the kind of character that you normally go to a library. So we've talked about architecture's relationship to character plasticity before, the capacity of architecture to put you in one character or another, and the tradition that architecture would put you in the right character for an institution. So if you look at this building, the whole building is already designed by the architect, and all this attention is going to all these weird surfaces and uses of color and interior decoration and stuff, carpeting. So this is a picture I took out of a magazine. It's the wrong picture. Like, this is trying to show you that floor, but this is the right picture. The right picture is to see the connection between the events on the inside and the events on the outside as one continuous connection that transforms the outside into a completely different world. And then you can start to notice, it's not just about how colorful things are, but it's about creating a sense that it's a kind of, I don't know what the word is, like a club. And so this surface, like for example, if we follow the yellow, it goes all the way up through the building, goes under through the stacks and comes out the top. So the way the single surface is being done here is not through a literal connection, but through this hysterical use of decorations on the surfaces and through the circulation. So, and also to make sure that you understand that there's a kind of position against the idea that this belongs to the city as such. You see this little garden. It's obviously a fake garden. It's obviously not Seattle's nature. It's kind of built there in a kind of ridiculous way. And then it comes in as carpet. So the street surface is being changed to something else. And that something else we're going to call the metropolitan field. And what this building is about is to say, look, if all these other buildings that we've seen that were single surface buildings, they would actually bring the actual street in. But this building is arguing that in the world we live in today, the city is not the things that are next to us. So try to remember this, like this thing right here. I know I do this a lot, but I never think of saying these things until, this is about literally bringing in the city. Remember, those things look like the local buildings. There's the real street. That's the real sidewalk, and then that becomes the sidewalk. This building is saying something else. This building is saying the materials that constitute our everyday lives and the relationships that we have are really not local anymore. Every time you walk into a shop and you buy something, that stuff is from somewhere else. It's from China, it's from India, it's from Costa Rica, or it's from New York or California. Or if you're in New York and you go eat Wonder Bread, it's from Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio is is best represented around the world in terms of Wendy's and Wonder Bread and football whistles. We make we make the best whistles in the world. So every place you go in the world now that's a city is no longer a city in the sense of an urbanity, meaning the buildings that are around and that the people are around there are from that area. Most of my friends are from different cities, different states, different countries. I suspect that's true for you. I grew up with friends that were in my neighborhood. Some of them I'm in contact with, but I'm as used to having deep and real personal relationships with people that I don't see every day and that I rarely talk to on the phone or email as the people that are around me. And this goes even further for your generation because your social relationships in things like MySpace and whatever they're called, Second Life. What's the one that's the big one? What is it? Facebook. Do you go to Facebook? Do all of you go to Facebook? What do you do there? Like, what does it mean to be addicted to Facebook? Like, I'm not kidding. I'm afraid to go because I'm easily addicted to things. But what happens to you? You meet a lot of people, right? But even though many of your real friends are the friends that you face-to-face relationships, you also make alternative friends. So this construction of authentic communities that are no longer based on location and proximity is what we call a metropolitanization of the city, or the metropolitanization of first world life. And buildings, that's a problem for buildings, because buildings are about being in a place and being together. So this building is trying to acknowledge that. And in a certain way, a library has always been that. A library has always been collections of books from around the world and collections of thoughts from around the world. The other thing it tries to do is change what it feels like to be in a library. So you go in the library, say if this is the card catalog, or what we used to call a card catalog, I don't know what they call it. This is where you look up references, find out where books are in the library. But it looks like a trading room, like a stock market or a stock commodity trading room. And it's to do that because the idea is that you're in there, you want to feel actively involved in the information as if it were a commodity or as if it were exciting. So the issue here is to not put you in the same mood or same attitude as the Whitney Library does, where you become contemplative and well-mannered in relationship to the art. It's exactly the opposite. It's to try to take you out of the character that you normally expect to be in a library and put you in a different character. And in so doing, connect you to the realities of what information is in the world today, and also the realities of what authentic communities are in the world. Plus, polka dots are in. So you see a lot of polka dots today. It's a good thing to do. You should wear polka dots. Now, I mean, this, you know, this is like Naugahyde. I don't know, see the top of this thing? It's like leather. How many libraries you go in when the ceiling is clad in leather? And if you look, let's see if I can find you some places. Like you see the red seat, there's blue seats and red seats. Over here. And if we look around other places, you can find out that the red seats get mixed in with the blue seats. Let's see if I can find them. So on the one hand, they're lined up here, but let's see. Like you see over here? See that one red seat in the line of all the blue seats? Basically, it's another way of kind of relaxing the sense that the architecture is establishing a protocol of order. So it's not representing individualism, but it's just basically relaxing stuff. It's like not everything matches, you know, and so not everything matches because we don't match. It's a way of relaxing the attitude in the library. Basically, the library is the thing that's up in those boxes. Everything else is like sort of being in a let's say a department store. And that idea today is one of the most current ideas. That is to get architecture to quit imposing, we've talked about this, to quit imposing traditions of authority. And one of the best ways to do that is basically build a stage set which puts you in a different character. So, now that's why this work of art is by perhaps Columbus's most famous the artist that lives here, Anne Hamilton. This is the reading room inside that library. Now it's a problem for me because unlike these surfaces and unlike the character of this stuff, this is a very interesting work of art. It's a work of art and it's in wood and in all those languages, and it says stuff about famous authors and knowledge, and it has sayings about knowledge. But it does exactly the opposite thing that the Cool House building is trying to do. Rem's Cool House is trying to not be a library, not be contemplative, not use materials that make you feel a sense of quiet. And Anne is, you know, so even though it's a great work of art, it's in conflict with the space and attitude of the library, I think. So you see this all the time. You see artists get commissioned, they'll do one kind of work of art, the building is about something else, as if the works of art and the building shouldn't be or shouldn't try to collaborate in their ambitions. We're gonna have Anne come to talk about this. Now we call this, so this is not just establishing a normal character, but we call these kind of uses of materials where you care about how they feel and you care about the familiarity of their textures and you know, the pleasures of the material themselves. We call that in architecture a phenomenological attitude about materials. It's just one of those long words that really, it just means we like the phenomena that materials produce as materials. And that we're going to discuss the Wexner Center in a second, and in order to do that, I need to set up this discussion with you. We've been to this museum. Remember, this is the Libeskind Museum, the one that's about the Holocaust. And you see these stelae. They represent the Nazis coming in and taking the ground out from beneath the feet of the Jewish people and putting them into exile. So symbolically, it's obvious. Peter Eisenman, the architect of the Wexner Center, also did a project in Berlin called the Memorial for the Murdered Jews of Berlin in Europe. And it looks like a bunch of stuff. It looks almost like a lot like this. So much so that they got really mad at each other. Peter Eisenman was Danielle Libeskind's teacher. Peter and Dandy got really mad at each other because they accused each other of ripping each other off. Dandy accused Peter of ripping him off. They do kind of look a little bit alike, but if we pay attention to this, the difference in this attitude, we're going to be able to understand something about the Wexner Center, which is why it's a conceptual project. And that's basically, in this thing, the materials are really important. So important that if you look at the cobblestoning of the floor, it's cross-grained. So when you're walking in that space, you feel claustrophobic and your feet hurt. You know, it actually hurts your feet to be in there. Whereas if you look at the murdered missing Jews, that's the exact material that you'll find on the average sidewalk of Berlin. You'll see that exact same kind of tile work in the expansion joints where, you know, where normally we put a crack. So they kind of decorate their concrete sidewalks with that material. And the reason for that is that this is about a kind of historical moment and trying to make it come back alive with a kind of symbolic and phenomenal sense of what happened. You get trapped in the building, all those shadows, you got caught. Whereas this is really a project not about what it's like to be in there, but what it's like to be out here. This is a new ground. See, this is all of these stelae, even though it's interesting to be inside, they create this wavy new ground. And so that's the new ground, the new future, the new possibility for a better Germany that Peter Eisenman's memorial says is going to be the possibility of not a good outcome, but something good to come out of the tragedy that occurred to the Jews. Now, what's interesting about this is you can't see that when you're there. You have to be away from that project to see its real architectural content. And that's what we mean, as we've said before, by a conceptual work. Anytime a work of architecture requires you or benefits from you not being in the building, not being about the experience, then that work is going to be conceptual. You have to be thinking about it. And there's no possible way to see this unless you're away from this building. And so that's the old ground. That's the old ground of Europe. This is the new conceptual ground of Europe. And basically the project sort of means if we think about what we did, we can build better futures. Now, in a certain sense, these photographs have a similar character. This is Albert Einstein writing equations on the wall. I'm not really interested in discussing the equations with you, just the effect of the photograph. You know, the effect of the photograph is to see someone you recognize writing on a blackboard in a way we hardly do today in one of the most famous moments of physics. And so the photograph itself has a kind of character very much like Danny Liebeskin's memorial, whereas Peter Eisenman's is much more like this. And that is, you see a bunch of stuff, you don't understand it, but the effect of the photograph is to make you admire it as something someone else has thought about. So it's really important. You don't really need to understand the concept. When we go to the Wexner Center, we're going to be discussing certain drawings like this. These are drawings that Peter Eisenman did, not for the Wexner Center, but for the School of Architecture in Cincinnati. And if you look at the school, they look just like those drawings, see? There's the drawings on the left. There's the school. And then the school becomes the drawings. And so Peter Eisenman is trying to produce an effect just like this. This is an impressive piece of intellection to you, whether you know what's in those formulas or not, okay? So it's doing its work whether you understand it or not, because its work has to do with changing your frame of mind about the expectations. So when you're in a building that looks like this or does something like this, it's about creating this mood of kind of conceptual mood. Doesn't mean the building's not important, because how the building gets built has got to support that project. But it's the key indicator to a project like the Wexner Center. So when we're looking at the Wexner Center, so this is how it's built. So when we look at the Wexner Center, we're seeing another kind of condition. We've seen some museums that try to bring the city in. We've seen some museums that try to change your character, museums and libraries. We've seen other museums that try to protect the works of art or the books from the city. The Wexner Center is a third condition. All it tries to do is make you think about what architecture is, what it should be, and what's in it. So in a certain sense, it's another way of changing the mood, but it's also about changing the mood to a conceptual frame of mind. Now, this is Ohio State University. This is the location of the Wexner Center in black. I'm going to show you the pictures of this was a competition held for this building, I think in 1980, 1983. These are the 5 things that you could have ended up with, or 4 things you could have ended up with. And you can get picked. I actually loathe the other 4. I hate them. Every time I see, sometimes I don't feel, sometimes I think, maybe the Wexner Center wasn't so good. I go back and look at these pictures and I say, thank God. This is, let's see, the way this works is this is the street, this is the oval. Obviously the idea for here, I'll use this laser, wood laser. The idea for the competition was it was going to get built right there at the end of that oval, and it was going to have a relationship to the library. That was the site recommended by the university. And that's exactly what this guy did. And he kind of puts this Greek fantasy in. So it's got, it's got a Greek temple, a Greek place to sit down. What do you call it? Amphitheater. I knew there's a technical word for that. Greek amphitheater, and then Greek pools, and then they have these women dressed in Greek bathing suits and playing with dolphins and stuff. And then there would be this ceremonial entry on High Street, and you would, can you imagine how awful that would have been? Your parents would have liked it, I'm sure. And then, so you kind of come in, you go downstairs, you go through there. Then I guess you hit that dead end, you see that wall. Not quite sure what happens when you do that. I guess you turn around and come back out. You never actually get into the university. This is by Michael Graves. This is a slightly better scheme. Michael Graves is going to become more important to us as we talk a little bit more about Columbus in a moment. And what he did was he puts the main building, he makes a ceremonial entry to this, instead of closing it off like the last one we did, he opens it up to the street, into the oval, so you see the library all the way out to the street, puts a ceremonial gateway, and then he puts this sort of in fantasy of French Enlightenment architecture. He just likes French Enlightenment architecture, and so he just does it wherever he can. And so that would be the museum. And you would enter there, almost exactly the same place, the Armory, and you see that little angle. It's unusual. So if you look at this project, everything is symmetrical, or if it's not, the diagram is completely symmetrical. So if I draw the diagram, it's really easy, and you can see it's like a cross. So even though that's different from that, they're exactly symmetrically located. Whereas in this project, there's this weird little rotation right there. Can you see that? So that thing doesn't go straight across. And so that rotation means there's something else going on. We're going to learn about that in a minute. But anyway, that's what that project was. And so this becomes the front of the building, and the front of the building faces Woodruff. This is another bad scheme. Oh yeah, by the way, this incredibly horrible bad scheme is by the same people that designed the business school. By the way, the thing about architects is they just don't go away. So if they lose one competition, they just keep coming back and keep coming back. And you're going to be, the last one is a guy named Caesar Pelli. I don't know. And there it is. And he changed the site, really put it back on the oval. This starts to look a little bit like the new student center, student union. Which if you actually want to earn an A in this class, you will go protest how bad it is. But don't worry, I'll do it for you. So that's what we ended up with. It's not so bad when you see the other stuff, right? Now, we have to kind of understand, it's got everything weird about it you could possibly have. It's broken up, it's got grids in it, you can't really find a building, you can't find a front door. You just don't, it just makes no sense whatsoever. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Okay, step one is to understand that this is the grid of the city. See the lines that they're at this angle? See that? Whereas the grid of the campus, as established by the oval, is 12¼ degrees rotated from it. Okay? So what this project is going to start off being about is taking the grid of the city and the grid of the campus and integrating them to each other so they get tied together in a kind of knot. Now remember something, you don't have to know any of this stuff, and it gets much more complicated, and I'm not going to teach you all about it. Because it's just like those physics equations. It's not about knowing the physics, it's about the effect of the photograph. So the reason, in other words, the reason we look at that photograph is not because we're interested in the physics, but we admire the intellection and we understand it says something about our intellectual life. But the other thing that's important to notice is if you look at the oval, it's actually not a perfect oval. It's biased, and if you draw it around, draw a circle around it, what happens is instead of completing itself, it comes out here. So this line that cuts through that axis is actually supposed to be the extension of the oval's trajectory as a real oval as opposed to an ideality. So over and over and over again, that you will find out that conceptual architecture will be often about critiquing the idea of an ideality in favor of the potential of reality to produce a better or more interesting result. And so those are the two big ideas. One is the completed oval that produces that axis, and the other is these two axes. And it goes on and on and on. And then, so there's Eisenman's sketches about the two grids. Also, he's trying to figure out how do you stop the idea that there's such a thing as history that's linear. He's trying to get the architecture to be more and more conceptual. It means the more you know about it, the more interesting it becomes. And he discovers that in 19-something or another, there used to be an armory on this site that burned down. And that, if you see its original footprint up there, and then what he decides to do is use the architecture to dig the armory back up, break it apart, and sort of put it back as a ghost, but have the process of designing the architecture move it, leave its footprint, and fragment it. And so you can see those are his initial sketches. It came out pretty close. This is that little wall that you see that's it's called the trace of the armory. See it over there? And then the armory gets moved down over here and becomes a fragment or a kind of memorial to it. Now what's interesting about the building is how close the building looks to the actual building. Although, in other words, the idea that the architecture would get built in such a way that it looks like a model belongs to conceptual architecture. So it's an anti-phenomenological use of materials. It doesn't mean you don't use materials. It means you use materials to get away from the idea that materials are about the pleasures of sensations or the smell or the warmth or the textures or the sounds that make or like the echo sounds. So anything that would reinforce the pleasure of an experience is going to get in the way of the work of conceptual architecture. And so that's what this is about. Now remember, the idea is you're going into a museum because museums are going to be telling stories always about what we should do or how we should be when we approach the work of art inside. So when we look at these, these are the broken apart armories. So the grids, those physical grids, which occur at in 4 different scales, 20, 24, 48, 12, 24, 48, 96-foot scales. There's 4 different grids. Those are the grids colliding from the grids of the city and the grids of the campus now turn physical. They become a sign. They're no longer organizational. He's turned the grids from an organizational idea into a signifying idea, or so you read it. And then as the grids collide, they break the armory apart. Now, this kind of construction is supposed to reinforce the idea that the armory is not about representing the old armory, that it's there as a set of layers, and each of those layers has to do with each of the 3 shifts that are in this drawing. So by the time it shifts, it brings with it a memory of its previous shift. And so incredible details like this are everywhere, and you don't really need to know why that grid is there. That's the 48-foot grid. Again, it's to produce the effect of looking at the board of equations. This stuff is brick veneer. It doesn't hold anything up. It's essentially a layer of paint made out of brick. In fact, not originally, there was an idea that they were going to whitewash all these things white. And even though the original competition model didn't do that, they had decided in the design process to whitewash all the brick white so it would look more ghost-like. They had all these brick studies out, and then Newsweek came and took a picture of the magazine took this picture of the magazine. It became so popular that the university stopped Eisenman from putting whitewash on the brick. But if you look here, this is a dry vit. This is just, any of you ever had a cavity? Any of you ever had a filling, or not a filling, what do you call it? Where they put in a temporary crown or a temporary filling until you have to go back? They basically fill your tooth up with sort of strong stuff, and in a couple of days it goes away. What is that stuff like? Yeah, temporary filling. Permanent fillings last. Temporary filling is pretty much the first piece of gum you chew. It's gone. Well, basically this stuff is architecture's version of temporary fillings. It's just, architects hate it. It's the worst stuff. But he put it there precisely so this didn't look real. So it didn't look like a brick tower. So it looked like these models, which actually, if you look at the sides of them over here in the gray, are filled with temporary filling. So the construction of the building is about reinforcing its conceptual ambitions, which means that photographs like this, which are so popular, and which are the fun part of the building, have absolutely nothing to do with the building. Peter Eisenman had no idea this was going to happen. It was a complete accident. I remember walking down this with him for the first time, and we just went, that's amazing, he had no idea. But so this photograph seems to be about this, but what it's actually showing you are the kinds of things that are going on in the building that are actually more important. This change of materials is notating, painting, the intersection of those grids. And if you look way up at the top, you see that little white line that's going across? Okay, that's there for the same reason. So it's all these little annoying details and collisions that are supposed to cause you to be thinking about the building, not this sort of perspectival experience which is completely accidental. And if you look at the change of materials, they basically occur everywhere in the building, outside, inside, and they're all notational. They're all about getting you to read the building, stop and think. None of the structure holds up anything. And so it's turning it's turning the reality of architecture, whether it's a structural element like that column, which is supposed to be holding up the ceiling, or the organizational element like the grids of the city, it's turning all of those things into signs that you can read or symbols that you can read. And to make sure you understand that, they don't hit the ground. And they end in the middle, they go into places, these are the two columns that are in the staircase. Now, what the heck is a column doing in a staircase? So even if you don't know what the story of the building is, you can know that the building is challenging the idea that architecture has the right place to be. Like, you shouldn't have, who belongs in a staircase? You belong in a staircase. And when you go in the galleries, you can't have these kinds of, I'll show you that in a second. See these columns that are everywhere, they kind of interrupt the walls. Now, this is a list by one of my colleagues of everything that's wrong with this building. Because, so I'm not going to tell you, and I don't think any of that, I think he's probably right about everything he says. Front entrances are hard to find. One can also trap wheelchair users. I don't know if that's such a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to trap wheelchair users, but it is a good thing to have a front entry that's hard to find. It's a good thing because front entries that are easy to find produce a ceremonial arrival. They create that threshold effect we were talking about. It's like going up a staircase. They cause one to enter into a certain expectation about what the art is going to be, how important it's going to be. And so not being able to find a front door is true, and from a normal point of view would be a disadvantage, but it's actually one of the effects that the architecture is trying to use to its advantage. It's like you go into a church, but if you go to Sunday school and you go to the back door, sometimes you go through the kitchen and then you get to you ever go to the church, what do you call the main thing, sanctuary the wrong way? Or when the priest is not there, go hang around look where his robes are and stuff, or at synagogue. It's kind of fun. It changes your relationship. You don't really feel in awe of it anymore. And so all of these bad things are true, like people slip on ramp and walkways, that's something we want to happen. That way, the people get a closer relationship to the ground. Anyway, numerous joints create many roof leaks present as expected. Now, he wrote this when the building was built, and sure enough, 10 years later, they had to close the building and fix all the leaks. So, it's not wrong. I'm not here to tell you, as a building, it's a great building. I'm telling you, despite the fact that it pretty much sucks as a building, it's a great work of architecture. And that's why we have so much fun. Because everything we do wrong, we just take credit for it. This is one of my favorite slides. Bad design. See it? Bad design. Now, I think the fact that that's there means that this is good design. You know, the fact that skateboarders use this as a place for graffiti and ramps, and in other words, it makes the oval less formal and allows for these kind of spontaneous events, is partly what it's trying to do. So, I don't know. You can decide if you like this slide or you don't like this slide. I think the fact that it would end up having that kind of discussion is in some sense a measure of the success of the building. I won't belabor all this stuff. There were some weird ideas. You see that that was supposed to be a line of trees, you know, so didn't never get built. All right. Because of those two staircases, if you're doing shows in the Wexner Center, and because it's a conceptual work of architecture, it gives you chances to do shows if you're a curator to take advantage of that. I worked there for a little while. I did a show called Sweet Fantastique. These are the galleries you have to hang in. See the columns everywhere. It's noisy. It's visually noisy. You see all the changes in materials. Everywhere you look, everything about the museum is trying to distract your attention away from the art. It's competing with the art. It's basically arguing that neither the people in the building nor the art have the right to expect architecture to get out of their way. You know, architecture has every right to be demanding as much attention as the people in the museum and the art, and to make you think about it. And so I did this show basically in the first gallery. I won't go over it, but in the second gallery, this is a kind of interesting gallery. This is this gallery. In this gallery, I was hanging the drawings of Danny Libeskind, the guy who did the museum in Berlin for the Holocaust Museum, and the guy that had a huge fight with Peter Eisenman. And at this point in time I did this show, they still weren't talking to each other, even though they were both friends of mine. They both had to come. So for the fun of it, I took Danny. First of all, the thing I did is I hung all the drawings. If you can see, they're not on the wall. So I made sure Danny's drawings didn't have to touch Peter's building. But the interesting thing is these are his drawings. These are architectural drawings. These are incredibly valuable architectural drawings. So remember all that stuff I've been teaching you about your homework, that you put as many lines as you can and as much nonsense as you possibly can. That's how you make a good architectural drawing. So this is the space. You can see it's got all this. This is a different show. It's got those columns. You can see them trying to figure out. They built this wall up on the top. This is a very traditional. The Wexner Center, they oftentimes do that. The real wall is at an angle, but they build this wall so they can hang paintings, and they try to avoid the columns. Instead, what I did was these drawings, these are drawings about how the straight line happened in history. That's what the story of these drawings are. It doesn't really matter. So, but if you can see, that it starts with, they start really complicated at that end, and then they get really thin. And so this final straight line is right there, which is kind of like the climax of the series. And I put it behind Peter's column. So, so when Danny came, you know, he's looking at it and he said, well, I'm not so sure about this. Peter came, oh, that's a great idea, you know. So you're using the architecture, sometimes frivolously and sometimes privately, but also to reinforce and to change the role of the art that's in it according to the conceptual possibilities of the architecture. So this drawing, which is the final drawing, is behind, you can see it, it's kind of behind that column. You have to kind of look for it. And there's other ideas in those, you know, I mean, I won't go into them all. But this wall, which now you can't, if you go up to see it now, you can't see it because yet again they put a wall back up so they could put the Warhol show in and block the light. But that wall was there. I took it down, and these drawings are hung at 58 inches, which is the standard height for hanging. Sorry, 54 inches, which is the standard height for hanging works of art in a museum. It's kind of average for everybody to see. But because of that angled wall, you can that wall over there is this wall, except it's got a big top been put on it. But because of that, at 54 inches, they start to fall off the wall. And so the museum itself criticizes the idea of one standard height for everybody. And the drawings get to fall off. Plus, you get to realize, these are Eisenman's drawings for House 6. They look just like the windows behind it. So a lot of neat things can happen in museums like this if you know how to take care of it. But then I got fired, so I wasn't able to do this much longer. Now, Greg Lynn, if any of y'all had a chance to hear Greg Lynn, this was his project. This was a project. Most of his work came from, most of the most important work he's done as research have come from commissions from the Wexner Center. Okay, got one more project to show you. And that's the Columbus Convention Center, how it came to be what it is today. It too was a competition. And it had 4 entries in it. Michael Graves, the guy that was in the, I just got through showing you. Peter Eisenman, the guy who won it. A guy named Wes Jones, he was Michael Graves and Peter Eisenman's student at Harvard, really great architect. Then a 4th guy from California named Barton Myers. Barton Myers is sort of a middle-of-the-road average commercial architect. So as soon as the competition started, these 3 weirdo architects, Eisenman, Graves, and Wes Jones, were basically had to do really simple designs because they were having to compete with this guy named Barton Myers. 2 weeks into the competition, Barton Myers doesn't think the budget's big enough. He quits. Okay, so you have these 3 weirdo architects who like to do weirdo buildings. They go crazy. Okay, they now decide the only possible way they can win this competition is do something unbelievably extreme. So it was, sorry, they did. So this competition was for a building to be built in 1992, which was the 500th year anniversary of Columbus's voyage to the United States. Now, it should strike you as being funny that Columbus, Ohio is named after Columbus. We are a landlocked city in the middle of the country. But we are, and we were named after that because after we were incorporated right after the 400th anniversary in 1892 with a land fraud deal. Columbus essentially, a bunch of landowners bought land here in the middle of the state, bribed the legislature to move the capital here, and then sold them. Sounds familiar, right? That's the way good things happen. Anyway, so you can tell that this is a scheme somehow or another. There's Columbus, there's the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and if you look carefully, there's a gigantic ocean liner in it. See, ocean voyages then and now. It's a pretty creepy scheme, but it's actually also a really interesting scheme. So you see all the boats and stuff. It's interesting because remember that shift, that angle I said is strange in the Wexner Center? I want you to pay attention. If you see that blue piece right there and you kind of move it back, then those 2 bars form an H. See that? And so when you see it slide that way and it kind of rotates on this little axis right there, pushes the bridge across, then all of a sudden the Hyatt, which is at that weird angle, so the idea is he puts a diagram down, so there, see the Hyatt, which kind of explains the forces. Why? Something wrong? No? All right. This kind of explains, you have this weird angled building, and all of a sudden this building looks like that angle has pulled it apart, causes this public space to be right in front of the church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and so this big square gets produced, lines up with the streets, all the stuff gets pulled down to line up with the streets. It's kind of like a piece of grammar, like diagramming a sentence. So the idea was you could put a diagram in the city and produce incredibly interesting relationships to the city any way you wanted to, and then you could decorate it with any kind of symbolism you wanted to decorate it with. So the architecturally interesting thing in here is this formal diagram of of making the building relate to the context in a profound and interesting way, and to try to not just match the context, but get the forces of the context that are latent, make them manifest in the building. Now, y'all know the other newspaper? They reviewed this competition. They said, we got 3 choices, poop, snot, and vomit. This was the vomit scheme. So you can see the diagram. This was the second scheme. This was a scheme by Wes Jones. Wes Jones was a young architect. He was the student. The guy that was the head of the jury was a friend of Peter Eisenman and a friend of Michael Graves, but he actually hated them. As architects are, it's just like that. I guess it's like that in everything, but he came out here and he had decided in his mind that he was going to give this project to Wes Jones no matter what. You know, he had just decided, that's it. I'm going to give this young architect a chance. But Wes Jones didn't know that. So Wes Jones thought he had to go to extremes to win the competition. He didn't think he had a chance at all. There was a rule in the competition that said any entry that was more than 15% over budget on its first estimate was disqualified. So if you look at this building, it came in and it was 80% over budget. Okay, so the jury was supposed to disqualify it. The jury was supposed to happen in one day. It didn't happen. That's because the head of the jury kept trying to talk them into changing the rules. He spent 2 days trying to just get this thing to be allowed to be considered. He couldn't do it, and so it got disqualified. But the project is really interesting because instead of all that sort of many meanings and complicated diagrams and a little bit about Columbus and a little bit about ocean liners and a little bit about the diagram of the city, this is one big thing that just lands in the middle of Columbus like a flying saucer. And actually, in the presentation, he had this picture of it actually landing in Columbus like that. It ignores the street. Notice in other words, instead of reinforcing the street like Michael Graves does, see that? Reinforcing High Street. It absolutely turns its back on it, ignores it, puts a few signs up for the street so that when you're driving down, you'll hit people because you're watching the TV set on your cell phone. And then it sort of orients the whole building to the airport and to the highway, because for convention centers, that's really the front of the building. And so it's a gigantic machine, a lot like the Pompidou Center, basically criticizing all the existing architecture of High Street, just saying we need a new start. We need something big and powerful with one big, bold effect. That's all this stuff. And then he made one model that said, if you want it to be contextual, we can just paint everything white. There's this idea that you don't do contextualism. And to be really funny, to make it sort of contextual, on the back side, he writes in flowers, Columbus welcomes you. So that's how you know it's got to do with Columbus. And so that's from the airport. And so, you know, and everybody, the kids love this, the students love this. I think probably this was the most popular scheme, but it got disqualified. And so that leaves us with this scheme, which is what you see now. Now, this scheme is kind of interesting. Does many of the same things that Michael Graves did. Michael Graves and Peter Eisenman were partners before they split off and went in different design directions. They worked together, they taught together at Princeton, and they were partners. And so the way he analyzes this is very similar. He acknowledges all the streets, he leaves the space open for the church. But about 3 weeks into the project, he heard from somebody that was working in Michael Graves' office that Michael Graves was doing a project about Columbus's voyages. And so it turned out that so was Peter Eisenman. I'm sorry, about 7 weeks into the scheme. It was a 10-week competition. 7 weeks into the competition, he finds out that they're both doing projects about Columbus's ships. And Peter Eisenman figures, that if he goes to Columbus and there's 2 about the ships, it's going to be the other one that wins. And so he changes, with 3 weeks to go, he throws his whole scheme away. He sends Michael Graves a postcard of a sinking ship. Michael Graves finds out the kid in his office that had dinner with Peter, fires him. Peter then has to get that kid a job teaching, and he's teaching at Columbia now. It's a small world. So he had 3 weeks to come up with something. So for the first time in his life, instead of doing one of those complicated things, he just drew a sketch, and this is a sketch. But it's interesting about this is before computer architecture. This is the last sort of project that's done before the kinds of stuff we're going to start looking at next week, where computer architecture makes everything look sort of wavy and fluid. But Peter, you could sense it coming, and it has this really interesting ability to connect these three. These were the existing storefronts, so they kind of looks like they go out there and then they turn into the road. And so this building has this really unusual property of being able to take various aspects of the context, the force from the rotated Hyatt, the existing three-story extruded buildings, the highway, the materiality of, this is now called Abbott's Lab, but it was called Ross Lab at the beginning. In other words, it puts one thing down. It doesn't, it's not made of a whole bunch of parts like Michael Graves did, but it has this uncanny ability to draw all of these forces into it and to connect everything together in ways that they had never been connected before. And we're going to become, it's called the weak form effect, and we will study it a lot. However, that's not why it won the competition. Basically, everyone didn't like this project. This was the snot project. So just so you got it clear, when it's on your final and I say which was, this is vomit. Just, it should be easy. This is vomit. This is poop. I think they used a different word. And this is snot. The way he won this competition was really simple. He had a competition, he had a convention center consultant. All three of them did. Wes Jones never even met with his convention center consultant, didn't even bother. Michael Graves obviously met with his convention center consultant, but Michael, this is the bad part of a convention center, the big convention space. And so he stuck it in the back. All of that stuff is the offices, the meeting rooms, really nice public amenities, restaurants, very pleasant urban setting. But it turns out that there's a rule in convention centers that you have to walk from the hotel to the convention floor 4 times a day, at least. And so the maximum distance it can be is a 1/16 of a mile, or an 1/8 of a mile, whatever it is. Well, if you look at Michael's, in order to get it hidden in the back, it's more than 1/4 mile away. It's 4 times too long. So the numbers of times they had to walk all the way there and all the way back basically made it a really bad convention center. Whereas Peter's, even though no one liked the way it looks, and still no one likes the way it looks, all you had to do is walk from there to there. And that was it. And so once it was over, no matter, there was all these arguments about the architecture, all this stuff about weak form, postmodernism, all the stuff we got through talking about. The only reason he won the competition is that his just worked a bit. He just listened to the guy who said, distance is the thing. And now they've done this addition, Now, what's really funny about this building is the best thing about this building is the way it calls all this stuff in. But because the building got built there, all this property became valuable. It all got torn down, and it got built with other stuff, which is trying to respond to the Wexner Center, to the convention center, and it's really awful. I'll try to get some pictures of it next week. And I think that's it. Oh yeah, so I just want you to remember these slides. Remember the Einstein slide? Remember the two, there's Einstein and then there's a board. There's one more slide about that I wanted to show to you, which is about next week's lecture. It's about the effect of the computer on our lives. And it's this slide. So that's the stuff you can do on the computer, and that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Thanks.